The chair before the grand pianoforte stood empty. Sir Percival Sloane's carriage was already rattling toward Mayfair, and 300 of the best-dressed people in England watched a celebrated soprano falter on a note that should never have been asked of any voice alive. Lady Chartwell's fan had stopped moving. The Duchess of Alverley leaned forward a full inch, which in a duchess is a shout, and at the edge of the platform, on a hard chair no one had considered since September, sat a young woman in dove gray who was paid 6 guineas a season to turn pages and be forgotten. She was the only person in that glittering room who knew exactly what had been done to the music. She was also the only person in it who could undo it. She looked at the trembling singer. She looked at the score, so newly printed that the ink still smelled of the shop. Then Verity Alcott did the one thing a hired girl must never do, and to understand why, you must go back 12 weeks, to the morning she was engaged for the season the way one engages a music stand. Pomeroy's music shop stood 3 doors off Hanover Square, and Verity had a desk in the back room, where the light was poor and the pay was worse. 6 pence the sheet for fair copying, 8 pence if the composer's hand was bad, and the composer's hands were always bad. She had been at the desk since 7 that morning, copying a set of quadrilles for a publisher who would sell them under a Frenchman's name, when Mr. Pomeroy put his head around the curtain and told her to smooth her hair, because a countess was asking for her. Lady Chartwell filled the front of the shop the way a frigate fills a small harbor. She was 50, handsome, rigged out in half a shop full of silk, and she examined Verity through a lorgnette for the better part of a minute before she spoke. She required, she said, a person for her Thursday musicales, a person who could read any music at sight, who could turn pages for whatever performer sat down, who understood transposition marks and repeats and the tempers of nervous performers, and who could do all of it without being noticed at all. Her last page-turner had blushed and dithered, and once, catastrophically, had sneezed during a fantasia. The terms were 6 guineas for the season, a plain gown to be worn at every evening, arrival by the servant's stair, and no conversation with the guests. "It is not a position for a lady," Lady Chartwell said, meaning it kindly, which somehow made it worse. "It is a position for a pair of hands and a pair of eyes and no face to speak of." Verity did the arithmetic without moving her own face at all. Her sister Letty's school in Highgate wanted £9 by Lady Day, and the copying desk would bring in perhaps 5 by then, and the rent on the 2 rooms above the Glovers was due whether music was wanted in London or not. 6 guineas was the difference between Letty staying at school and Letty coming home to learn what their mother had never lived to teach either of them. She said she would be honored. She was 21 when her father died, and she was 23 now. And in the 2 winters between, she had learned that honor was a coin like any other, and spent where it had to be spent. Her father had been Thomas Alcott. If the name means nothing, that is because publishers made very sure of it. Half of England had sung his songs at one time or another, in parlors and pleasure gardens and around regimental pianofortes, and most of that England assumed he had died rich, or died long ago, or had never lived at all, and was simply a name printers put on things. He had died 2 winters past, of a pleurisy caught teaching in an unheated assembly room, and the sale of his instruments had covered his debts with £4 left over. Verity had kept only his brass tuning fork, which lived in her pocket, and his ear, which lived between hers. He had trained her the way other men train sons for the law. Before she could write her letters, she could write a stave. By 12, she could hear a wrong note through a closed door, and by 17, she could take a song apart and set it down again in any key a voice required, at sight, without a smudge. none of which was worth sixpence to anybody, because the person who could do it was a young woman in a gray gown, and London does not pay for miracles it has decided not to see. On the last Sunday of every month, she walked up the long hill to Highgate to visit the whole of her remaining family. One freckled girl of 13 at Mrs. Treadwell's school for the daughters of gentlemen, an establishment whose gentility was measured, like most gentility, by the promptness of its fees. Letty Alcott had their mother's singing voice, their father's laugh, and no more ear than a boot, which Verity privately held to be the kindest arrangement Providence had made for anyone in the family, since Letty would never have to sit in a back room hearing what the world got wrong. On those Sundays, the sisters had the use of the school parlor and its old square piano, a quarter tone flat and settled in its opinions, and Letty would thump through her duets like a happy cart horse, while Verity supplied the treble and laughed until her sides ached. And for 2 hours a month, nobody in the world was hired by anybody. Before she left, Verity would take their father's tuning fork from her pocket, borrow the tuning key Mrs. Treadwell kept in the tea caddy, and set the worst of the strings to rights. And Mrs. Treadwell, who was shrewd and not unkind, would let the account book lie open on the hall table where it could speak for itself on her way out. £9 by Lady Day. Letty always waved from the gate until the road bent. Walking back down into the smoke of London in the early dark, Verity did the same sums every month: coal, rent, boots, the 9 pence owed to the sempstress, and arrived every month at the same answer: that the sums could be made to come out so long as nothing in the world went wrong, and that she was 23, and the strange, patient joy of her days depended on remaining useful, silent, and entirely unremarkable to the people who paid. Remember the shape of that bargain. The whole of what follows is the story of it breaking. The first musicale of the season fell on a warm Thursday in September. Chartwell House blazed like a docked ship, every window gold, and Verity went in by the servants' stair with her folio under her arm and took the hard chair at the left of the grand pianoforte. And for the first hour, nobody looked at her once, which was, after all, what the 6 guineas were for. She learned the room quickly. She learned that Miss Honoria Bellamy, the season's reigning beauty, auburn and glittering and bored, sat where the candlelight was kindest, and said clever, cruel things behind an ivory fan for the pleasure of the 2 friends who laughed on schedule. She learned that Lady Chartwell counted her evening a success by how many titles were in the first 3 rows, and she learned that when a frightened girl sits down to perform, the whole room can smell it, the way hounds smell it, and settles in to enjoy the kill. The frightened girl that first evening was a baronet's daughter, Miss Farlow, 17 and white as the keys, playing a sonatina her master had chosen for his own vanity rather than her hands. Verity sat beside her, arranged the music, and did the small things nobody in the audience could see and no one had hired her to do. She turned each page a half beat early, so the girl's eye was never hungry. At the modulation that had no doubt wrecked her in every rehearsal, Verity let her gloved finger rest at the top of the passage a moment, a quiet signpost: here is the road. When Miss Farlow's breath went short before the final page, Verity breathed once, slowly, audibly enough for one person and no more, and the girl's shoulders came down and her hands remembered themselves. Miss Farlow finished whole. The applause was warm, the girl glowed, her mother wept discreetly into a shawl, and nobody in the room understood what had happened except 2 people. The first was Verity. The second was a man standing near the far doorway, who had not applauded with the rest because he had been watching the wrong performer, if by wrong we mean the one in gray. She noticed him the way one notices weather, without meaning to. tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his middle 30s, dressed in black so plainly cut it must have cost a fortune, and possessed of the kind of stillness that makes other men's ease look like fidgeting. She did not know him. She knew everyone's music and nobody's face. Then Lady Chartwell sailed toward him with both hands out, and Verity heard the title and understood that she had been breathing lessons at a baronet's daughter in front of the Duke of Rothwell. His Grace kept to the doorway, refused cards, took no wine, and left early. Miss Honoria Bellamy remarked to her friends, at a volume calculated to reach the third row, that the Duke came for the music and stayed for nothing else, but that the season was long, and so, fortunately, was her patience. What the Duke had actually come for, that first Thursday, not even the Duke would have said aloud, but he had stood in the doorway of Pomeroy's shop the previous spring, holding a second-hand song collection he had bought for the binding, and he had found, penciled into the margins in a small exact hand, corrections, not schoolroom scribbles. Corrections, an engraver's wrong accidental caught and mended. A passage every edition in England printed unplayably, quietly reset so that human hands could do what the composer had plainly wanted. Page after page, some patient, unseen intelligence had gone through the book straightening what the trade had bent, asking no credit and no fee. He had gone back to Pomeroy and asked who corrected his stock. Pomeroy, scenting neither profit nor trouble, had said only that a person did copying for the house, and the person's work was reliable, and would his Grace be wanting the new Clementi? The Duke had wanted, instead, every corrected volume on the premises. He owned 11 of them now. He recognized the hand the way you recognize a voice, and on that first Thursday of the season, from the far doorway of Lady Chartwell's music room, the Duke of Rothwell watched a page-turner in dove gray take a pencil from her sleeve during the interval and mend the Countess's copy of the very sonatina that had just been played, a small exact mark at the modulation, medicine left behind for the next frightened girl, and he knew whose hand he was looking at. He did not approach her that night. A duke crossing a crowded room to a hired woman is not a compliment. It is a sentence, and some part of him already did not want her sentenced. He bowed to Lady Chartwell, endured Miss Bellamy's smile, and went home to a house with 11 corrected volumes in it. Sir Percival Sloane arrived at the second musicale like royalty arriving at a coronation, which is to say certain the event could not begin without him, and correct. He was 60, silver-haired, magnificent, with a wine-colored velvet coat and rings that flashed when his hands rose from the keys, and he had been the most celebrated pianist in England for 30 years, and the finest for 20 of them, which are not the same thing, and did not need to be while the applause held. Verity had grown up on his name. Her father and Sloane had come up together, two poor young men sharing one hired instrument in a Soho attic, before their roads forked, one toward the platform and the plaudits, one toward teaching and the grave. Her father had never once spoken of him bitterly. The finest ear of our generation, Thomas Alcott used to say, and if he has spent it on being adored. Well, adoration is a room with a fire in it, and your father chose the cold. Sloane played that second Thursday, and Verity turned his pages, and she would have paid the 6 guineas back for the privilege. Whatever else the years had done, the man could still shape a phrase the way silversmiths shape a bowl, and the room held its breath where he wanted it held. But she sat closer than anyone in London had sat to him in years, close enough to see what the audience could not. She saw the great trill in the slow movement begin a fraction late and end a fraction thin. She saw him take the famous run in the last movement with a fingering no master would teach. 3 notes quietly surrendered out of a passage of 40, gone so smoothly that only 2 ears in the kingdom could have missed them, and one pair belonged to a dead man. And afterward, while the room roared and Lady Chartwell glowed and footmen went around with champagne, Verity, gathering the music, glanced through the glass of the tall window at the terrace beyond, and saw Sir Percival Sloane standing alone in the cold with his back to his own triumph, pressing his right hand hard against his breast, working the knuckles with his left, his face for one unguarded moment not magnificent at all, but old, and frightened and furious at being either. She looked away before he turned. She told no one. She had been hired, after all, to see nothing, and a great man was hiding something, and it was no business of a girl paid 6 guineas a season. That is what she told herself. 12 weeks before the night the whole arithmetic came due. By October the Thursdays had a rhythm, and Verity was the clockwork inside it. She came at 4 to lay out the programs, pin the loose sheets, test the instrument's temper against the weather, and set the candles where they would light the music without dripping on it. She knew by then which performers wanted their pages turned early and which wanted them late, which meant she knew which were nervous and which were vain, and she kept both kinds safe without either kind noticing. The guests learned her the way guests learn a good servant, which is to say they learned to stop seeing her. A dowager handed Verity her cloak one evening, mistaking grey wool for livery, and stood waiting until Verity carried it to the hall, and Lady Chartwell said afterward, not unkindly, that it was simplest not to correct such little confusions, as it only embarrassed everyone. Miss Honoria Bellamy never made that mistake. Miss Bellamy saw Verity perfectly well, the way a cat sees a bird it has decided to attend to later. It was Miss Bellamy who sent her for ratafia in the middle of a quartet, as though the music room were a coffee house, and Miss Bellamy who wondered aloud, sweetly, fan-tilted just so, whether it was quite wise of dear Lady Chartwell to let the hired help mark up the family's music in pencil. One really never knew what such people wrote. And it was Miss Bellamy who first said the words the season would not stop repeating. The Duke of Rothwell, she announced to her court, has attended every single Thursday. Every one. He refuses half the tables in London and comes to a musicale. Depend upon it, she said, arranging her ringlets, a man does not do that for music. For once in her life she was entirely right, and no one in the room, least of all Honoria Bellamy, understood how. Because the Duke did come every Thursday, and he stood where he always stood, near the far doorway with his shoulder to the frame, and if anyone had troubled to follow the line of his attention, they would have found it resting, evening after evening, not on the beauty in the candlelight, but on the hard chair at the left of the pianoforte. He had learned her the way she had learned the room. He knew she read the music whole before the performer began. One long sweep of the eyes, the way other people glance at a letter to see who signed it. He knew she conducted, secretly, one gloved finger against her knee, when a tempo went astray and she could do nothing else lawful about it. He knew that on the evening a viscount's son had sung insultingly flat to a room too polite to say so, her finger had stopped conducting and lain flat and still against her knee like a witness declining to testify. And he had nearly laughed aloud in the doorway, alone, at a joke made by a woman who did not know she had an audience. The 3rd week of October, Lady Chartwell received a note in a ducal hand suggesting, among other civilities, that the young person who managed the music might be given a chair with a back to it, as the evenings were long. Lady Chartwell, who would have reupholstered the entire house at a duke's suggestion, complied without ever wondering why a duke had noticed a chair. Verity wondered. She sat that Thursday in modest comfort, and her eyes went to the doorway once, and found him already looking, and both of them looked away with such perfect timing that it constituted a kind of conversation. They had spoken. By then, exactly twice. The first time was the fourth Thursday, when he had come early on some pretext about a score he wished Lady Chartwell to hear, and had found instead the music room empty except for the girl in grey, who was at the instrument an hour before the guests, not practicing, simply playing. Some slow private thing in a minor key with her eyes half shut, the tone so clean it seemed to tidy the room around it. She had stopped the instant she heard him, risen and begged his Grace's pardon. He had asked her to finish it. She had said, "I am not engaged to play, Your Grace, only to turn what others play," and there was no insolence anywhere in it and no surrender either, just a fact set down where he could see it. The way she set down corrected accidentals. He had looked at her for a moment and said, "Then I shall hope someone engages you to play before I am too old to hear it," and bowed, a duke bowing to a page-turner in an empty room, and gone away before she could decide what her face was doing. The second time he had brought a book. He produced it at the interval, in the window bay, away from the crowd, with the caution of a man doing something he had rehearsed and disapproved of. A worn oblong volume, green boards, the gilt worn off the spine. Songs by Thomas Alcott. She looked at it, and her breath behaved strangely. "My father," she said. "I know," said the Duke. "Pomeroy told me, eventually, it cost me 4 volumes of Handel to loosen him." He opened it to a page where a penciled hand, small and exact, had reset a passage the engraver had mangled. "I have 11 books mended this way," he said. "I bought them for the bindings and I keep them for the margins. Whoever did this," and he said it looking at the margins and not at her, "understood the songs better than the man who printed them, and possibly better than the man who wrote them." "No," she said, before she could stop herself, "not better." He would say, and her voice did the thing voices do when the dead walk through a sentence, he would say the print is only a letter from the composer, and half the postmasters on the road are drunk. The Duke laughed, once, short, real, the laugh of a man surprised into it, and Miss Bellamy's head came around from 30 feet away like a compass needle finding north. After that he did not seek Verity out again, and she understood the arithmetic of that too, and was grateful, and told herself the gratitude was the whole of what she felt, and knew precisely what the telling was worth. There was one more kindness that autumn, and it never once said its name. On a black wet Thursday in late October, she came down the servants' stair at midnight into rain like harp strings, 4 streets from any hackney stand, her folio under her cloak, and past a plain, unmarked carriage waiting at the corner with its lamps lit, and did not know it, and walked home wet through, and the carriage did not follow or offer, because the man inside it had worked out with some care that a duke's carriage stopping for a hired girl at midnight would cost her the only wealth she had, which was her character. And so he simply sat there in the dark like a fool, as he later admitted, making certain she reached her own door, and then drove home. What arrived instead, that same week, was a commission at Pomeroy's, a gentleman's library of manuscript parts to be set in fair copy. No urgency, no name. The work to go to the best hand in the house at treble the usual rate, payment quarterly in advance. Pomeroy rubbed his hands and gave it to Verity, and Verity copied the first sheet and stopped, because the manuscripts were songs, her father's songs, the unpublished ones, the ones that existed nowhere in the world except in a trunk under her own bed, and evidently in fair copies her father had once sold in lean years to collectors. Somebody had spent months buying them back together, without fuss and without a name. She never asked Pomeroy the client's name. She was 23, and poor, not stupid. And there are gifts that can only be accepted by pretending not to see the giver, and both parties to that transaction understood the terms and kept them all the way to April. November brought the two events that armed the season. The first was that Miss Cecilia Marlowe, the young soprano London had decided that year to adore, left Sir Percival Sloane. She had been his pupil since girlhood, his discovery, his evidence, the freshest jewel in a crown that had privately begun to need jewels, and in the space of one fortnight she thanked him in a letter, engaged Signor Farinelli's old rooms, and put herself under the instruction of Mr. Considine, whom Sloane had called, in company, a piano tuner with opinions. Sloane said nothing publicly. Men of his eminence do not brawl. But Verdi turned his pages that month for a private concert, and where his marked fingerings had once said crescendo here, patience here, sing, the new markings, pressed into the paper, said nothing at all, and his tempi had a new and punishing brilliance, as though the instrument had informed on someone. It was in those same weeks that Verdi first spoke with Cecilia Marlowe, and it happened over a pin. The soprano came to Chartwell House one afternoon to try the room before a private evening, attended by Mr. Considine and a headache, and found her music already on the desk, the turns pinned, the cut she preferred in the second verse marked in light pencil, and the whole set ordered so that not one page would need turning during the long-held note that was her glory. Cecilia Marlowe looked at the pin turn for a moment, then at the young woman in gray setting candles, and said, "Who did this?" And Verdi said, "I did, madam," and begged pardon if she had presumed. "Presumed," said Cecilia. "The last person who prepared music for me like this was paid £40 a year and thought himself cheated. What is your name?" And when she heard Alcott, she set down her gloves and said, "Not Thomas Alcott," and sang, half voice, right there among the covered furniture, the first two lines of a lullaby he had written before either of them was born, learned from her own nurse in Somerset. And the two women looked at each other across 30 years of one dead man's music. And after that, whenever Cecilia Marlowe sang in that house, she asked that the gray girl and no one else should sit at the accompanist's left. It was Lady Chartwell, scenting sentiment the way she scented rank, who conceived the crowning stroke for the Duchess's evening, that Sir Percival should accompany his famous pupil one final time. The master and his nightingale reconciled before all of London, whatever their private weather. Cecilia, who was generous before she was wise, agreed. Sloane kissed her hand before witnesses and called it a happy thought. The second event was the announcement. Lady Chartwell rose before her guests, pink with the honor of it, to say that the season's final musicale, the second Thursday of December, would be graced by the Duchess of Alverley herself, and that her grace intended that evening to establish by subscription a series of public concerts for the following year, and to name the musician who would direct them. The room understood at once. The subscription would be the making of whoever held it, an income, a platform, a small permanent kingdom. Miss Marlowe would sing the great aria from the new opera as the crown of the evening, accompanied, naturally, by Sir Percival, whose claim on the directorship was naturally beyond dispute. Naturally, said everyone. And yet the betting book at more than one club that week held other names, and one of them was Considine's, and everybody who repeated that fact did so in the voice people use when they are watching something large begin, very slowly, to lean. Verdi watched it lean from closer than anybody. She was at Chartwell House the gray November morning Sloane came to try the instrument, unannounced, when the room was cold and the covers were still on the furniture, and she heard, through the door she had been about to open, the sound that ended her doubts. He was playing the aria's accompaniment, the true one, the one in C. The key Cecilia Marlowe's voice sat in like a ring in its box. He played 16 bars gloriously. Then his right hand stumbled on nothing, on a figure a schoolgirl could manage, and stopped. And there was a silence. And then a single crash of both fists on the keys, a sound like a door slammed inside a church, and then very quietly in the empty room an old man's voice saying, "Not yet, not yet, 12 days, hold for 12 days." She went away from the door on servants' feet, unseen, with her heart hammering as though the shame were hers, and she would have carried his secret without a word forever. It was his, and grief was in it, and her father had loved him once. What changed everything was sixpence. 4 days later, at Pomeroy's, at her copying desk behind the curtain, she heard Sloane's voice in the front of the shop, and it had its magnificence on again. He was commissioning fresh performance parts for the aria, the vocal line, and the accompaniment both, to be engraved new from plates he himself would supply, because, he said, the published edition was a disgrace of misprints, and her Grace's evening deserved perfection. It was to be done by Feltham, and only Feltham, and delivered to Sloane's own hands, and no proof shown to anyone else, on his account and at double the fee for the discretion. Mr. Pomeroy, smelling double fees, agreed to everything. Verity sat behind the curtain with her pen stopped over a quadrille and a cold thread walking down her spine. Fresh parts, days before a performance, sight unseen by singer or house. A man who could no longer trust his own right hand, buying discretion. It could be vanity. It could be exactly what he said. She had no proof of anything and less standing to ask, and the season had taught her to the bone what happened to hired girls with opinions. But as he swept out, Sir Percival Sloane paused at the curtain without looking through it and spoke 5 sentences no one else in the shop could hear. "I know your hand, Miss Alcott," he said pleasantly. "I have seen it in the margins all season, mending betters who never thanked you. You have your father's ear. It would grieve me, truly, to see it strained before great company. Some pages, child, are better left unturned." And he was gone, bell jangling, leaving her alone with the quadrilles and the cold. If you have ever sat where Verity sat, unregarded in a back room while a great man buys silence at double the fee, if you have ever known something was wrong and known equally that no one would believe the person you are, then stay with me now. And if these quiet reckonings are why you come here, subscribe. Because what Sir Percival Sloane did with those 12 days, and what one-page Turner did about it in front of 300 witnesses, is the reason London still argues about that December evening. The second Thursday of December came down on Grosvenor Square like a frost and a festival at once. Chartwell House had been 3 days dressing for it. Hothouse roses in December, white soup and negus for 300, the good plate out of the vaults, and over all of it the particular shrill hum of a hostess who knows that one duchess in the first row outweighs every other triumph of her life. The Duchess of Alverley arrived at 9. Small, ancient, and terrifying, wearing diamonds with the indifference of a woman who has outlived 4 kings' fashions, and was installed in a gilt chair from which she could see the platform, the room, and straight through most of the people in it. The carriages had begun setting down at 8 and were still coming at 10, link boys running ahead of them with torches, the square ringing with iron and harness, and inside, under 4 chandeliers trimmed that afternoon, everyone who governed anything in England by birth or marriage stood shoulder to shoulder, pretending not to count who else had been asked. Miss Bellamy wore silver, and stationed herself where the Duke must pass. Mr. Considine came, was seen, and was gracious, which was its own kind of wager. Verity had been in the house since 3. The parts had come from Sloane's own hands only that evening, wrapped and sealed, laid on the instrument's desk by his man, with instructions that no one was to disturb their order. She had not touched them. She had thought about them for 11 days, the way you think about a tooth that has not yet begun to ache, and she had told herself, in her father's voice, that suspicion without proof is only fear with a better opinion of itself, and she had gone on laying candles. The first half of the program belonged to Sloane, and Sloane, that night, was heroic. Verity turned for him and heard what it cost. He had built the half out of the music that still lay safely under his hands, stately, spacious things, no glitter. And he shaped them with such authority that the room took the restraint for grandeur. Only from the hard chair could you see the right hand hoarding itself, spending nothing it could not cover. A general deploying a broken army so cunningly the enemy never learns which regiments are ghosts. It was, in its way, the finest performance she ever heard him give, and no one in the room but the two of them knew it was a retreat. At the interval, among the compliments, he made his move, and she watched him make it. He mentioned ruefully to Lady Chartwell, at a volume several persons could not help sharing, that his hand had taken a chill on the stairs, the old complaint. Nothing. But perhaps as a precaution the aria should be entrusted to younger fingers. His own assistant, Mr. Quill, was present, a sound, faithful reader, and the parts, thank heaven, were newly engraved and true, so there could be no difficulty. And then, smiling, patting Lady Chartwell's arm, the sentence he had carried all evening like a knife in a nosegay. After all, dear lady, every sheet of music in this house has passed through one pair of hands this season, and we must all simply trust, must we not, that those hands have left everything exactly as the composers wished. 30 people heard it. 30 people glanced, some of them not even knowing why, toward the left of the pianoforte, where a young woman in dove gray was arranging a gilt chair for Mr. Quill. The frame was set before the picture was painted. Whatever went wrong tonight had been given its explanation in advance, and the explanation had ink-stained fingers and no family to make a noise about it. Mr. Quill was 40, mild, and honest, a man who had spent 20 years being reliable within 4 bars either side of exactly what was printed. He settled his spectacles, Verity took her place at his left, and Miss Cecilia Marlowe came to the bend of the instrument in white, glowing. One hand on the mahogany, the loveliest thing in London, and about to be ruined. The sealed wrapper came off the parts. Quill set the accompaniment on the desk, Verity smoothed it flat, and her eyes did what they had always done. The one long sweep her father had trained into her before she could write her letters, and the room tilted. The page was beautiful, fresh, black, crisp, expensive, and it was written in E. She knew that aria the way she knew her sister's face. She had copied it, whole, 4 times that autumn at Pomeroy's, taken it apart and set it down again until every interval of it lived in her hands. It sat in C. It had been published in C, rehearsed by Miss Marlowe for 3 weeks in C, and its final phrase climbed even in C to the very rooftop of a soprano's compass, to the note that brings a house down precisely because it is barely possible. Lifted a third higher, that phrase was not music. It was a trap with a woman's name on it. The voice would climb and break, publicly, before a duchess, before the subscription, before all of London that mattered, and every wise head in the room would say afterward that poor Considine had overworked the girl, that she had left the master who knew her voice too soon, and Sloane needed only to sit in his chair, nursing his chilled hand, and be proved indispensable by the wreck. And if any voice was raised about the parts had passed through the notorious pencil of the hired girl. Verity looked at Mr. Quill. Mr. Quill was frowning faintly at the page, aware, in his reliable way, that the key before him was not the key of the edition on his own shelf, and arriving comfortably at the conclusion that the new engraving must represent the composer's late correction, because it was official and sealed, and Sir Percival had said the old edition was a disgrace. He would play what was set before him if it were written in gunpowder. There were perhaps 40 seconds. She spent 10 of them being afraid. It is worth saying plainly, because there are people who will tell you courage is the absence of arithmetic, and they have never been poor. In those 10 seconds, Verity Alcott counted everything a hired girl counts: 6 guineas, 9 pounds by Lady Day, Letty's school, the copying desk, the word of a knighted legend against the word of a nobody, the certain, absolute impossibility of ever being engaged by anyone in that room again, and she set the whole sum against one truth her father had left her in place of money: that music is a trust, and everyone who can hear is a trustee. And then the introduction began. 4 bars. Quill played them cleanly in E, and Verity watched understanding arrive in Cecilia Marlowe's face like ice forming on a window. The singer's pitch was not absolute, but her body knew where that first phrase should sit, and it was sitting wrong, high, alien, and her eyes went in one wild sweep from Quill to the empty chair where Sloane lounged with his hand wrapped tenderly in a silk handkerchief, and found no rescue anywhere. And her first phrase came out white and small, a lovely voice suddenly alone on a ledge in the wind. The room heard it. Rooms always hear it. Fans slowed. Somewhere in the 3rd row a whisper ran along the chairs like a mouse. Miss Bellamy's chin lifted a fraction, scenting the kill, and the Duchess of Alverley's face settled into the terrible patience of the very old, who have seen everything ruined at least once. The phrase climbed. Cecilia reached the first summit a third above her life and took it by main force, and it cost her a crack you could feel in your own throat, and the whisper became a rustle, and Mr. Quill, sweating, faithful, played on into the abyss note for note as printed, because that was the whole of what he knew how to do. Cecilia stopped singing. She stood at the bend of the instrument with her hand pressed flat on the mahogany, 20 years of work dying in front of her, eyes bright with the specific horror of a performer who knows the wound is mortal and the room is watching it bleed. And Mr. Quill trailed off, and the silence that followed had teeth. And into it, pitched to carry, honeyed with concern, came the voice of Sir Percival Sloane. Poor child, poor child. But then the parts, who can say, so much has been handled this season. And his gaze, sorrowful, forgiving, came to rest with the whole room's gaze behind it on the girl in dove gray. This is the moment the evening had been built to produce. One ruined singer, one blamed nobody, one indispensable old lion. It produced instead a sound nobody present ever forgot, the small dry snap of a false accompaniment being closed. Verity stood up. She did not look at Sloane. She stepped past Mr. Quill, who yielded the bench with the gratitude of a drowning man yielding an anvil, and she said to Cecilia Marlowe, "Lo," the words only the 2 of them in the front row ever heard, and the front row repeated for the rest of their lives. "Where does it live in your voice tonight? In C, still." And Cecilia, staring, whispered, "In C, but the parts," and Verity said, "I shan't need them."